how Viking people slept, which turns out to be far weirder than most of us could imagine. If you think you know what a good night's sleep looks like, the Vikings would probably laugh in your face right before inviting you to squeeze in next to a goat for warmth. Forget your memory foam mattress, blackout curtains, and white noise machine. Viking sleep was something else entirely weird, and not just because it often happened in a room full of strangers, livestock, and the occasional axe. We're talking about a world where privacy didn't exist, where beds were status symbols, and where waking up in the middle of the night to tell stories or tend the fire wasn't insomnia. It was just Tuesday. These were people who faced 6 months of nearly endless daylight and 6 months of endless darkness, who sometimes slept in shifts on warships, and who believed dreams weren't random brain fluff, but direct messages from the gods. And that's before we get to the truly weird stuff. Sleeping with protective amulets under your pillow in case of spirits. Wearing your day clothes to bed, sometimes still wet from the ocean, because changing was a luxury. Or using layers of animal hides so thick you could barely move, but at least you wouldn't freeze to death. Even their nightmares had a supernatural twist. Some Vikings feared a creature called the Mara, a night spirit that would ride your chest while you slept, leaving you breathless and terrified. This was a world where the line between comfort and survival was razor thin. Your bed, if you even had one, wasn't just a place to rest. It was where you listened to sagas, whispered gossip, planned raids, and stayed alive through bitter winters that could kill the unprepared. In longhouses, whole families, servants, and animals shared one smoky, firelit room, the air thick with the smell of wool, wood smoke, and whatever was cooking or rotting in the corner. The weirdest part? Some of these habits weren't just strange by modern standards, they actually made sense for the Viking world. In a land of extreme seasons, unpredictable seas, and constant threat of attack, sleep had to be flexible. You couldn't afford to drift into deep, blissful slumber without a thought for the cold creeping in or the stranger standing over you with a spear. That's why so many Vikings slept with weapons within arm's reach, why some preferred short bursts of rest over long, vulnerable nights, and why they often positioned themselves in ways that allowed them to see who was moving in the dark. Over the course of this journey, we're going to step into the smoky glow of the Viking longhouse, sail across rough seas to cramped bunks on warships, and explore the strange mix of superstition, practicality, and pure toughness that shaped how these people slept. By the time we're done, you might be rethinking what weird really means, and maybe, just maybe, picking up a few Viking tricks for your own midnight routine. Step inside a Viking longhouse, and the first thing you notice is the heat, or rather, the mix of heat and smoke that clings to everything. These buildings were the heart of Norse life, stretching long and narrow like a ship turned upside down, built from timber, turf, and whatever the land could offer. At the centre, a long fire pit burned day and night, not just for cooking but for survival. Without it, the cold would creep in fast, especially during the endless nights of winter. The smoke drifted upward toward a smoke hole in the roof, but it never truly escaped, so the air stayed hazy, smelling of wood smoke, wool, and a faint tang of livestock. And livestock wasn't just part of the smell, it was part of the room. Cows, goats, and sheep often shared space with their human owners, penned along one side of the longhouse. In the warm months, they grazed outside, but in the freezing dark, they became breathing, snorting radiators. Their body heat helped keep the household from freezing, and their presence meant food, milk, and wool were within arm's reach. It also meant the occasional hoof in the ribs if you were unlucky with your sleeping spot. Sleeping arrangements weren't about privacy. In most longhouses, the family, servants, and sometimes even visiting neighbours all slept in the same open space. The wealthiest families might have partially enclosed sleeping platforms, wooden alcoves raised off the floor, lined with straw mattresses and covered with furs. These were tucked against the walls to capture heat from the central fire. For everyone else, the bed was wherever there was room. Straw was spread directly on the floor, perhaps with a rough blanket on top, and you curled up fully clothed to keep warm. This communal setup wasn't just practical, it was social. Nights were noisy affairs. The crackle of the fire, the shifting of animals, the murmurs of whispered conversations, and yes, the chorus of snores filled the dark. There was comfort in the closeness, a shared sense of safety. No one slept entirely alone unless they had to, because in the Viking world, being alone at night wasn't just lonely, it was risky. The layout of the longhouse reflected hierarchy. The head of the household and their family claimed the warmest, most protected spots, usually nearest the fire, but away from the drafts near the doors. Servants and lower status members took whatever space remained, often closer to the livestock. Children were nestled in with parents or older siblings, bundled in shared bedding for warmth. For the Vikings, the longhouse was more than a home. It was a fortress against the elements, a gathering place for work and feasting. And at night, a giant communal bedroom where human and animal life mingled in a strange but necessary harmony. It wasn't quiet, it wasn't clean, and it certainly wasn't private. But in that world, it was the closest thing to comfort you could get. A Viking bed could tell you more about a person than their clothing, their jewelry, or even the size of their ship. It was more than a place to collapse after a day of rowing or farming. It was a silent display of status, wealth, and how much comfort you could wring from a harsh, unpredictable world. The poorest Vikings slept on the floor, on a layer of straw or hay spread directly over packed earth or wooden planks. If they were lucky, the straw was stuffed into a rough linen or wool sack, creating what passed for a mattress. If they weren't, it was just loose straw, shifting and poking through the night, carrying the faint smell of the field it came from. For wealthier families, the bed became something else entirely. Raised wooden frames, sometimes ornately carved with spirals, knotwork, or animal designs, lifted sleepers above the cold floor. These beds might be lined with feather mattresses or stuffed with soft moss and wool, then piled high with blankets, furs, and hides. Reindeer and sheepskin being particular favourites for their warmth. In these homes, a bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was a statement piece, often placed in an alcove or curtained nook to keep out drafts and create a sense of privacy in a world where privacy was almost non-existent. The difference between the high-borne bed and the low-borne pile was more than just comfort, it was survival. A raised frame meant fewer encounters with the crawling pests that thrived in straw. It kept you farther from the cold, seeping through the floor, and the occasional puddle from a leaky roof or tracked-in snow. And it was sturdy enough to last years, even decades, being passed down through generations as part of the family's most valued possessions. Bedding materials were seasonal and practical. In winter, blankets and hides layered thick enough to trap heat became essential, especially in longhouses where fires dimmed during the night. In summer, lighter woven wool might replace the heavy furs, though the straw base stayed the same. Pillows, when they existed, were stuffed with feathers or even dried seaweed. They weren't the plush clouds we know today, but they were better than resting your head on the hard planks. For those on the move raiders, traders, and explorers, the bed was whatever you could carry. On ships, that meant sleeping on benches, coils of rope, or thin bedrolls spread wherever there was space. Comfort was sacrificed entirely for the sake of the journey. In the Viking world, the bed was more than a piece of furniture. It was a boundary between you and the cold, the dirt, and the creatures that wanted to share your warmth. For some, it was a carved, fur-lined throne of rest. For others, it was a thin layer of straw between themselves and the hard, unyielding earth. Either way, when night fell, the bed was where every Viking king or farmer surrendered to the long dark. In the Viking world, bedtime didn't just mean curling up with your family. It often meant curling up with the family goat, a few sheep, or maybe even a cow. It sounds strange to modern ears, But for people living in the biting cold of Scandinavia, animals weren't just food on legs or sources of wool and milk. They were living heaters, breathing, snorting bundles of warmth that could make the difference between a long winter night and a final one. Inside a Viking longhouse, animals were typically penned along one side of the main hall, their stalls separated from the human sleeping areas by a low partition or even just a line of posts. In the summer, this meant the air was thick with the smell of hay, manure, and fur. In winter, it meant life. The body heat of a few cows or sheep could raise the temperature in the longhouse noticeably, especially when combined with the steady glow of the central fire. For Vikings, without the luxury of thick feather bedding or multiple layers of furs, that shared warmth was as valuable as gold. This arrangement wasn't without its drawbacks. Sleeping next to animals meant accepting the sounds of the barnyard as your nighttime soundtrack snorts, shifting hooves, the occasional bleat, or lowing in the dark. There was also the risk of being stepped on if a restless cow decided to shuffle in its stall, but to the Vikings, these were minor inconveniences compared to freezing through the long subarctic nights. Animals also provided a kind of security. Their reactions could warn of danger wolves prowling near the house, a stranger approaching, or even changes in the weather. A spooked sheep or a restless horse could wake an entire household faster than any human guard. In this way, livestock became part of the family's protective circle, not just its food supply. For children, sleeping near animals could even be comforting. The steady breathing and warmth of a cow in the corner offered a kind of rustic nightlight, a reminder that life was all around them in the dark. It also meant that in the morning, milk for breakfast was just a few steps away, still warm from the source. The wealthy, of course, had more options. They could afford better insulation, thicker bedding, and longhouses large enough to keep their livestock a bit farther from the main sleeping space. But even among the elite, complete separation was rare in winter. The logic was simple. Why let all that free heat go to waste? To a modern mind, sharing your bedroom with a cow might seem absurd, maybe even unsanitary. But for the Vikings, it was as natural as tending the fire or bolting the door. It wasn't about preference. It was about survival in a land where the cold could kill, and warmth, no matter the source, was something you never turned away. In Viking lands, the rhythm of sleep wasn't dictated by clocks or alarm bells. It was ruled by the sun, and the sun could be a strange and unpredictable master. In the far north, summer brought endless daylight, the kind that bled into the night until night was just a word. Winter did the opposite, swallowing the days in darkness so deep it felt like the sun had abandoned the world altogether. This dramatic swing between light and dark shaped not just how Vikings worked and travelled, but how they slept. In summer, true night was fleeting. The sky might dim to a dusky blue for a few short hours before the sun rose again, making it difficult for the body to settle into a long, deep rest. Farmers and fishermen took advantage of those bright nights, working late into what would normally be bedtime. Some historians believe Vikings adopted shorter, more frequent naps during these months, catching rest when they could, rather than forcing themselves into a rigid nighttime schedule. The land demanded flexibility, and the people obeyed. Winter was a different story, one of near-constant darkness and bone-deep cold. With so little daylight, sleep often stretched longer, but not all at once. Vikings, like many pre-industrial societies, practiced segmented sleep. They would rest for several hours, wake for a period in the middle of the night, then return to bed for a second round of slumber. That waking period wasn't idle time. It was used for mending clothes, tending fires, sharing quiet conversations, praying, or even slipping outside to check on the livestock. In the dead of winter, those hours could be the only chance to do certain chores without daylight. The psychological effect of these seasonal extremes can't be overstated. In summer, the endless light was energizing, even intoxicating. People could travel, trade, and raid for longer stretches, taking advantage of the sun's generosity. In winter, the darkness could be isolating, almost claustrophobic, but it also encouraged closeness. Families gathered in the longhouse, sharing warmth, food, and stories, while the wind battered the walls. Sleep became a communal act of survival, the household huddling together like a single living organism waiting for the sun's return. These seasonal shifts also influenced belief. Dreams in the dark months were often considered more potent, carrying messages from gods or ancestors. In summer, when sleep was lighter and more restless, such dreams were less likely to be trusted. The cycles of light and dark weren't just background, they were woven into the fabric of Viking life, shaping everything from daily chores to spiritual interpretations. To live in the Viking world was to accept that sleep was not fixed. It bent and shifted with the seasons, stretching long in the winter's cold shadow, breaking apart into fragments under the midnight sun. The Vikings didn't fight these changes, they adapted, letting nature set the terms. After all, in a land where the sun could vanish for weeks or refuse to set at all, your best chance at rest was learning to sleep when the world allowed it. For the Vikings, sleep wasn't one long, unbroken stretch from dusk till dawn. Like many pre-industrial peoples, they followed a rhythm modern science now calls segmented sleep. The night was divided into two distinct halves, separated by a period of wakefulness that could last an hour or more. This wasn't insomnia, it was simply how life worked when candles were expensive, firewood was precious, and the night stretched on for what felt like forever. The first sleep began not long after nightfall, especially in the winter months, when darkness swallowed the land early. Wrapped in furs or blankets, the household would drift off to the sounds of the fire crackling, the livestock shifting in their stalls, and the wind worrying at the walls. For a few hours, the longhouse would grow still. Then, almost as if on cue, people began to stir. Eyes opened. Quiet conversations started. The long night's watch had begun. This waking period was practical as much as it was cultural. Fires needed tending to keep the bitter cold from creeping in. Animals had to be checked. Tools could be repaired in the flickering firelight. Some used the time for prayer or quiet reflection, believing the night hours to be especially sacred, a time when the world was silent enough for the gods to listen. Others took advantage of the privacy that the middle of the night offered for more intimate purposes. After all, with the whole family and sometimes guests sleeping side by side, moments of seclusion were rare. It was also a social hour. People whispered stories, shared plans for the next day, or traded gossip. In the glow of the embers, faces looked softer, and the world felt smaller, as though the longhouse was its own little island in a sea of darkness. This was a liminal time, half in the waking world and half in the realm of dreams, and the Vikings seemed to understand its value. When the watch ended, people returned to bed for their second sleep. This final stretch carried them into the pale light of dawn, or, in winter, into yet another hour of darkness before the sun reluctantly appeared. Second sleep was often deeper, more restful, the mind unburdened by the tasks and small conversations that had filled the waking interval. Modern historians and scientists have suggested that segmented sleep might actually be closer to our natural human pattern, one disrupted only by the arrival of artificial light and the rigid schedules of industrial life. For the Vikings, it was simply normal. The night was a long road, and it made sense to pause halfway, warm yourself by the fire, speak to your family, or whisper a prayer to Odin before carrying on to the morning. In that world, the quiet space between first and second sleep was not a problem to solve. It was a gift to be used. For the Vikings, warmth at night was never guaranteed. In the long, freezing winters of Scandinavia, keeping the cold at bay was as important as locking the door against wolves. A warm bed could mean the difference between waking up in the morning and never waking at all. That meant using every available resource, some practical, some creative, and a few that might make a modern sleeper raise an eyebrow. The most prized bedding was made from reindeer hides. Thick, soft, and naturally insulated. They trapped heat like nothing else. Sheep and goat skins were also common, the wool left intact for maximum warmth. Layered on top of straw mattresses or wooden bed frames, these hides turned a simple sleeping space into a snug cocoon, at least for those who could afford them. Beneath the hides, woven wool blankets offered another layer of defense. Wool was a Viking's best friend in winter. It stayed warm even when damp, and given the snow, sleet, and sea spray that were part of daily life, dampness was inevitable. For poorer households, warmth was a patchwork affair. A single coarse wool blanket might be shared by several people, with bodies huddled together to conserve heat. Children often slept between parents or older siblings, tucked into the center of the bed where the cold was least likely to reach. In some homes, dried moss was stuffed between layers of fabric as makeshift insulation. Others piled on layers of worn clothing at night, treating their own garments as part of the bedding. And then there were the less glamorous tricks. In truly bitter weather, heated stones were sometimes placed near the bed, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. The heat didn't last long, but it was enough to take the edge off the initial chill. In longhouses, where livestock shared the living space, the animals themselves provided a steady supply of warmth. Sleeping close to the cattle pen or goat enclosure might not smell pleasant, but it was undeniably effective. Some Vikings even took advantage of the longhouse's architecture. Sleeping platforms were often built into alcoves or raised against the wall, partly enclosed to trap heat. The smaller the space, the easier it was to warm with body heat alone. These sleeping nooks also reduced drafts, which could sneak in through doors, roof gaps, and the smoke hole above the central fire. To the Vikings, comfort was secondary to survival. A bed piled with furs wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, as vital as a good sword or a sturdy boat. Every layer, from the coarsest wool to the softest reindeer hide, was part of the nightly battle against the cold. And in a world where the wind could howl for days, and ice could lock the land in silence, victory meant waking up in the morning still wrapped in warmth, ready to face another day. In a Viking longhouse, where you slept said almost as much about you as the clothes you wore or the weapons you carried, the arrangement wasn't random. Bed placement followed an unspoken but well-understood hierarchy, a nightly reminder of who held power and who simply held a place in the room. The head of the household, usually the chieftain, landowner, or most senior family member, claimed the best spot. This wasn't just about comfort, it was about safety and status. Their bed was typically positioned in the warmest, most protected corner of the longhouse, away from drafts and close enough to the central fire to enjoy its heat without choking on the smoke. If the family was wealthy, the bed might be enclosed on 3 sides with wooden panels or heavy curtains, creating a private alcove that shut out the noise and flickering light of the room. Carved bed frames, feather mattresses, and fine wool blankets marked it as a place of authority, a miniature throne for the hours between dusk and dawn. Directly near them slept the rest of the immediate family spouses, children, and sometimes trusted relatives. This was both practical and symbolic. The closer you were to the head of the household, the more protection and warmth you enjoyed. Servants and farmhands were placed farther out, closer to the livestock pens, or along the outer walls where drafts crept in. In large households, the difference between the chieftain's bed and a servant's sleeping mat could be as stark as carved oak versus bare straw. Guests were a special case. In Viking culture, hospitality was sacred, and visitors of high rank were given places of honor, sometimes displacing lower status family members for the night. A traveling warrior or important ally might find themselves in a well-padded bed near the fire, while the unfortunate displaced resident shuffled off to sleep on the floor or in the coldest corner. For those of lower rank, Sleeping meant making do with whatever space remained, often directly on the floor with straw for cushioning. These spots were noisier, colder, and offered little privacy, but they still carried a sense of belonging. In a world where being outside the walls at night could mean freezing or worse, even the draftiest corner was better than no corner at all. This spatial order wasn't just about comfort, it reinforced the social structure every night. The bed you slept in, or the patch of floor you claimed, was a visible reflection of your place in the household and, by extension, the community. You didn't just wake up in the morning, you woke up reminded of where you stood. In the Viking longhouse, warmth and rest were precious commodities, and like all precious things, they were distributed according to rank. A good bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a nightly affirmation of power, respect, and the invisible lines that held Viking society together. For a Viking warrior, sleep was never guaranteed, and it certainly wasn't something you could take for granted when you were far from home. On raids or long voyages, rest had to be carefully measured out too much, and you risked an ambush, too little, and exhaustion could dull your sword arm. The solution was simple and brutally practical: sleeping in shifts. On the open sea, a Viking longship was a marvel of engineering, but a miserable bedroom. The crew rowed in shifts, and when they weren't pulling the oars, they snatched what rest they could on the benches, lying on cloaks or coiled ropes. There was no shelter from the wind or the spray, and no such thing as privacy. You might drift off under a pale northern moon, only to be jolted awake by a wave crashing over the gunwale. Sleep was light, broken, and often more about keeping your body from collapsing than about actual comfort. Even on calmer waters, a constant watch was kept. Someone always had to scan the horizon for other ships, changes in weather, or the telltale flicker of enemy sails. The crew rotated duties, each man taking his turn at the oars, then at the watch, then grabbing an hour or two of rest before the cycle began again. In this way, the ship never slept, even if its crew did, one at a time. Camps on foreign shores weren't much better. When the longships beached and the tents went up, the same principle applied. Half the warriors rested, while the other half stood guard, eyes on the dark tree line or the distant glow of a village fire. The guards paced quietly, listening for the rustle of movement, the snap of a twig, anything that might signal danger. They knew that in a raid, the moment of greatest vulnerability was when you were asleep, weapons laid aside, and mind adrift in dreams. The men on watch weren't just looking for enemy warriors. They also had to guard against thieves, wild animals, and even their own fires getting out of control. Meanwhile, those who slept did so with weapons within arm's reach. Swords still in their scabbards, axes resting beside them, shields close enough to grab in a heartbeat. Many slept in their boots or with their cloaks still wrapped tight, ready to move at a moment's notice. It was a hard way to live, but it kept them alive. In the Viking mindset, comfort was a luxury, readiness was survival. Whether on the deck of a creaking longship or on the cold ground of a foreign shore, every hour of rest was borrowed time, owed back to the demands of vigilance. And when the watch changed and it was your turn to close your eyes, you did so knowing someone else was standing guard in the dark, because if they didn't, no one might wake to see the morning. When night fell in the Viking world, there was no grand ritual of changing into soft cotton pajamas or sliding under freshly laundered sheets. Sleepwear, as we think of it today, simply didn't exist. A Viking went to bed in what they had worn all day, or at least in a stripped-down version of it, because warmth and practicality mattered far more than style or cleanliness. For most, the idea of owning a separate set of clothes just for sleeping would have been laughable. Clothes were expensive, every piece either hand-woven or painstakingly stitched, and they were expected to last. A farmer might have 2 or 3 sets in total, one for working, one for better occasions, and perhaps an old, patched tunic for the dirtiest tasks. Wasting one of those precious outfits on sleep was unthinkable. So at bedtime, you either loosened your belt, and kept your day clothes on. Or, if the weather was mild enough, you shed your heavier layers and slept in an under-tunic or simple linen shift. In the depths of winter, even that was a luxury. Many slept, fully dressed, boots and all, wrapped in cloaks or furs to trap body heat. The cold was a relentless thief, and the extra minutes it took to dress in the morning could be the difference between frostbite and readiness. For the wealthy, there was more choice. High-status Vikings sometimes had lighter, softer linen garments they could wear to bed, especially in warmer months. These shifts or nightshirts weren't necessarily made for sleeping, but they were comfortable and clean enough to keep bedding from getting soiled by the grime of the day. Even then, these garments were often just repurposed underclothes, not some special sleepwear category. The reality of Viking bedding also shaped what they wore to bed. Straw mattresses, wool blankets, and animal hides didn't exactly encourage lounging in bare skin. The layers between a person and the floor or the cold night air were limited, and sleeping fully clothed added one more shield against the chill. It also helped guard against pests. Lice, fleas, and other unwelcome bedfellows were a constant presence, and a layer of clothing might at least slow their advances. There was also the matter of readiness. On voyages, during raids, or in dangerous territory, sleeping in your day clothes meant you could spring into action without fumbling for garments. A belt could be buckled in seconds, weapons could be grabbed, and you'd be on your feet before an enemy had time to reach the campfire. For warriors, this wasn't just convenient, it was essential. So while the modern mind might recoil at the thought of climbing into bed unwashed, in the same clothes worn for labour, travel, and battle, for the Vikings, it was second nature. The night wasn't about comfort, it was about staying warm, staying ready, and waking up alive. And in that world, you didn't need pyjamas, you just needed the will to face whatever came in the dark. To the Vikings, dreams were never just idle wanderings of the mind. They were messages, whispers from gods, omens from the spirit world, or warnings carried by the dead. In a culture where the unseen was as real as the waves beneath a ship, sleep was not an escape from life, but a doorway into another realm, one that could change the course of a day, a battle, or even a life. The Norse sagas are full of dreams that shape destiny. A chieftain might wake from a night's rest, certain that Odin himself had visited him, offering cryptic advice or veiled warnings. Warriors heading into battle might see themselves victorious in dream visions, or lying lifeless on a blood-soaked field. Such dreams weren't brushed aside as superstition. They were weighed and discussed, sometimes in front of the entire household, as if the gods had sent down a private message for all to hear. There was a hierarchy to these visions. Some dreams were thought to come directly from the Aesir and Vanir, the gods themselves, while others might be sent by the spirits of ancestors, lending their guidance to the living. But there were also darker origins, malevolent beings, restless dead, or trickster spirits that might twist a dream into a curse. Discerning the source was crucial. A dream from Odin could be a gift. A dream from Loki could be a trap. Interpreting these night messages was an art. Some relied on personal instinct, trusting the gut feeling a dream left behind. Others sought the wisdom of a seer or Volva, a woman skilled in prophecy and magic, who could unravel symbols and signs. A raven in a dream might signal news from afar or the approach of death. Waves rising higher than a ship could mean an overwhelming enemy. A sword breaking could foretell betrayal. These beliefs weren't abstract, they had real consequences. A bad dream before a raid could delay or even cancel the mission. A warrior who dreamed of falling might refuse to fight that day, fearing the Norns, the weavers of fate, had already cut his thread. Conversely, a dream of victory could rally morale, filling a crew with such confidence that they rowed faster and fought harder. For the Vikings, dreams blurred the line between the waking and the divine. They were a reminder that the world was woven from more than just wood, stone, and flesh. It was spun through with fate, magic, and gods who took an active interest in human lives. To ignore a dream was to risk defying that greater weave. So when a Viking lay down at night, pulling a reindeer hide over his shoulders, he did more than close his eyes against the cold. He opened them to another world, where the gods might speak, the dead might walk, and the future might be glimpsed in the fragile flicker of a dream. In the Viking world, the night was never entirely safe, even inside the thick walls of a longhouse. Sleep could open the door to more than dreams. It could invite something far darker. Among the most feared of these nocturnal threats was the Mara, a night spirit said to ride sleeping people, pressing down on their chests until they could neither move nor breathe. To those who experienced it, the Mara wasn't just a story, it was a crushing, suffocating presence that left you gasping in the dark. The sagas and folktales describe the Mara as a shapeshifter, sometimes a ghostly woman, sometimes an animal, and sometimes nothing more than a shadow with weight. She could slip through the smallest gap in a wall or a window shutter, find her way to your bed, and perch atop you, feeding on your fear. Victims would awaken in the night, eyes open but body frozen, feeling that terrible pressure and sensing something malevolent watching them. In modern terms, we might call it sleep paralysis, but to the Vikings, it was a spirit's attack, as real as any blade. The Mara didn't always come without warning. Some believed she was sent by a sorcerer or an enemy to torment you. Others thought she was the restless spirit of a wronged woman, doomed to wander in this form. In some tales, even a living person could become a Mara, if cursed, their souls slipping from their body at night to trouble others before returning by dawn. The effects of a Mara visit went beyond fear. People who suffered repeated rides were said to grow pale, weak, and restless, as though the spirit was draining their life. It wasn't just humans who were vulnerable. Livestock, especially horses, were said to be ridden by the Mara. A farmer might find his horses sweating and exhausted in the morning, their manes mysteriously tangled into tight knots. Protection against the Mara took many forms. Some Vikings slept with iron tools or weapons near the bed, believing iron repelled malicious spirits. Others carved protective runes into bed frames or wore amulets dedicated to Thor or Freya. Placing a broom or a pile of straw across the doorway was thought to confuse the Mara, forcing her to count each stalk before entering, buying the sleeper enough time to wake. But fear of the Mara also served as a reminder. The Viking night was a liminal space, when the world of the living and the world of the unseen lay close together. A strange sound, a weight on your chest, a shadow at the edge of the firelight. These could be the signs that something had slipped across that thin divide. And so, under the heavy furs in the longhouse, the Vikings slept with one eye always half open, never entirely sure if the next breath they took would be free or stolen by the Mara. For the Vikings, the act of going to sleep was never just about rest. It was about crossing into a vulnerable state where both the body and the spirit could be threatened. In the dark hours, when the longhouse lay silent but for the crackle of the fire and the shifting of livestock, unseen forces were thought to move more freely. Dreams could carry warnings, spirits could creep close, and fate itself could reach out a hand. So, the Vikings did what they always did when facing the unknown. They armed themselves. Not always with swords or axes, but with charms and amulets meant to guard them through the night. These talismans came in many forms. A small Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, carved from bone or cast in bronze, might be worn on a cord around the neck, kept on even in sleep so that Thor's strength would protect the wearer from harm. Runes, painstakingly scratched into bits of wood or stone, could be placed beneath a pillow or tied to the bed frame, each symbol chosen for its power protection, courage, safe passage through dreams. Some amulets were made from animal bones, teeth, or feathers, believed to hold the essence of the creature and lend its strength or cunning to the sleeper. For those troubled by nightmares or night spirits like the Mara, certain herbs were considered powerful guardians. Sprigs of juniper or rowan might be tucked under bedding, their scent and supposed magical properties creating a barrier between the sleeper and whatever prowled in the unseen. In some cases, iron objects, a knife, a nail, or even a horseshoe were placed near the bed, the cold metal thought to repel malicious beings. These protective items weren't always personal. In wealthier households, charms could be built into the very structure of a sleeping alcove. A carved post might hide runes beneath its surface. A bed frame might have small symbols burned into the wood where only the owner knew to look. Such details were often kept secret, as part of the charm's power was in its mystery knowledge that the sleeper was protected, even if the protection itself remained invisible to others. The presence of these items was as much psychological as it was spiritual. In a world where danger could come from sickness, enemies, or forces no one could see, the comfort of holding a charm in your hand before drifting off was as important as the protection it was meant to provide. It gave a sense of control over the uncontrollable, a small light of safety in the vast darkness. So, while the Vikings may not have had locks on their bedroom doors or walls thick enough to block out the howling wind, they had something else: faith in the objects they carried close. To sleep with a charm or amulet was to believe that the gods, the earth, and the strength of one's own ancestors could stand guard through the night, watching over you until the morning came. For the Vikings, the night sky was more than a backdrop for sleep. It was a living map of power, fate, and magic. The phases of the moon were not simply a way to mark time. They were believed to influence everything from tides and harvests to dreams and the strength of spells. To fall asleep under certain moonlight was to rest within the pull of forces far greater than oneself, and the Vikings knew it. They planned for it. On nights when the full moon bathed the world in silver, the longhouse might stay awake longer. The pale light poured through the smoke hole and cracks in the walls, giving the night an otherworldly clarity. Some believed this light sharpened dreams, making them more vivid and more likely to carry messages from the gods or the spirits of the dead. Others thought the full moon stirred restlessness. Warriors and sailors claimed it filled them with a strange energy, making deep sleep impossible. New moons carried a different weight. With no light in the sky, the world felt closed in and hidden. These were nights for secrecy, when magic worked in shadows. Some sagas tell of midnight rituals performed during the dark of the moon, small offerings left at the threshold, whispered prayers to Freyja for love or to Odin for victory. Sleep on these nights could be uneasy, as if the darkness itself pressed close, listening. Certain nights of the year had their own reputation. The solstices, when the balance of light and dark shifted to extremes, were thought to open thin places between worlds. On these nights, some might choose to sleep lightly, or even stay awake until dawn, guarding against wandering spirits. Others embraced the moment, lying down with protective charms, and hoping to dream true visions that could guide them through the seasons ahead. Magic and moonlight were also practical. In the warmer months, when the moon was bright, people might work late into the night, using the extra light to finish chores or prepare for journeys. Sleep could be delayed until well past midnight, and in communal spaces, this meant others were still moving about while some tried to rest. The rhythm of the household bent around the moon's glow. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Viking moon lore was the belief that you could harness it. A person might choose to sleep with their head pointed toward the east during a waxing moon to draw growth and good fortune, or toward the west in the waning phase to let go of illness or bad luck. Position, timing, and intention turned a simple act of sleep into a quiet ritual. In this way, the Vikings never truly surrendered to the night. Even in sleep, they were participants in the great cycles of the world above them, resting not just under a roof, but under the watchful eye of the moon, the gods, and the unseen currents of magic that flowed through the dark. On the eve of battle, Viking sleep was not the deep, peaceful kind found after a day's labour. It was a tense, ritual-laced pause before the storm. Warriors knew that what happened in the night could shape the fate of the coming day, and so they approached sleep almost as they would a weapon, with care, preparation, and respect for the unseen forces that might tip the scales of victory or defeat. Before lying down, many followed small personal rituals, repeated so often they became second nature. A warrior might oil his sword and place it within arm's reach, the blade angled toward the enemy's direction as if its presence could ward off bad luck. Others tied charms or runes into their hair, or tucked them beneath their bedding symbols, carved for courage, protection, and strength. For some, there was a quiet moment of prayer to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for might, or to Tyr, the god of war, for justice and bravery. Dreams that night carried more weight than usual. The sagas are filled with accounts of warriors whose fates were foretold in their sleep, visions of victory parades or funeral pyres, of ravens feasting or shields shining in the sun. To dream of a broken weapon or a ship sinking could be a chilling omen, enough to shake a man's resolve. Conversely, a dream of a wolf or eagle, both symbols tied to Odin, might fill a warrior with fierce confidence, as if the All-Father himself had claimed them for glory. Because of this belief, many tried to shape their dreams. Some drank herbal brews meant to bring clarity to the mind while sleeping. Others avoided certain foods, fearing they could invite nightmares. Sleeping position could even matter. Lying on one's back was thought to invite visits from spirits, while curling on one side was said to guard the soul more closely. But not everyone sought a full night's rest. In camps on the edge of enemy territory, warriors often slept in shifts, their slumber light and ears tuned for danger. Fires were kept low to avoid detection, and bedrolls were laid close together for warmth and reassurance. There was comfort in hearing a comrade's breathing in the dark, a reminder that no one faced the night alone. When dawn finally came, those who had dreamt well woke with a sense of readiness, convinced the gods had smiled on them. Those troubled by bad visions might keep them to themselves, unwilling to seed doubt among the group. Yet whether their dreams had been good, bad, or blank, every warrior rose with the same understanding by night's end. The time for rest was over, and the day ahead would demand everything they had. Sleep before battle was not an escape. It was the final moment to steel the spirit, sharpen the will, and step into the day knowing fate was already in motion. Sleeping on a Viking ship was less about comfort and more about survival. These were not spacious vessels with cozy cabins. They were long, narrow warships or sturdy cargo boats, built for speed and endurance, not for a good night's rest. Space was precious, every inch dedicated to rowing benches, cargo, weapons, and provisions. When the time came to sleep, the crew made do with whatever spot they could claim. On warships, most men slept right where they rode, spreading a cloak or animal hide over the bench to take the edge off the hard wood. There were no hammocks swaying gently above deck like in later sailing traditions. Viking ships weren't built for that. Instead, some crew members stretched out on the deck itself, curling up between oars or leaning against the gunwale for support. A few lucky ones might have a small chest or shield to rest their head on, though it was hardly better than the planks beneath them. Cargo ships allowed slightly more comfort, but only slightly. A Nar had more space below deck, and on longer voyages, sailors might roll out bedding of straw, furs, or woven mats. Still, the air was damp, the space cramped, and the sound of the sea constant. You slept to the rhythm of the waves, sometimes rocked into a shallow doze, sometimes jolted awake by a sudden pitch or splash. Privacy was non-existent. Your shipmates were always within arm's reach. Their movements, snores, and restless shifts part of the nightly soundtrack. Weather dictated much of the sleeping arrangement. In calm conditions, some preferred to sleep under the open sky, wrapped in cloaks with their faces turned from the wind. But when storms hit or icy spray soaked the deck, everyone crowded under tarps or sailcloth, huddling for warmth. Wet clothes stayed on, more often than not, drying them, was nearly impossible at sea, and stripping down only invited the cold to bite harder. Voyages could last days or weeks, and the lack of quality sleep took its toll. Sailors learned to nap whenever they could, an hour here, half an hour there, grabbing rest during calm seas, while anchored, or when the wind carried the ship without need for rowing. In dangerous waters, sleeping was done in shifts, with half the crew resting while the other half kept watch. It wasn't comfort that sustained them, but resilience. For the Vikings, sleeping on a ship was part of the price paid for exploration, trade, and conquest. The hard benches, damp furs, and cramped quarters were the bedfellows of men who chased horizons. And when they returned to land, even the humblest straw bed in a smoky longhouse must have felt like luxury compared to the restless, salt-soaked slumber of the sea. When Viking raiding parties made camp on foreign shores, sleep was never entirely peaceful. Every night away from home carried the risk of ambush, bad weather, or an unlucky meeting with locals eager to defend their land. The goal was not comfort, it was survival, and every detail of camp sleeping was arranged with that in mind. The first step was choosing the right ground. Camps were often set up near fresh water, but with a clear view of the surrounding area, avoiding dense forests where attackers could slip too close unseen. Once the site was chosen, fires were lit, but never too many or too bright. A large blaze could be seen from miles away, so smaller, controlled fires were preferred. They were enough to keep the chill at bay, cook a meal, and dry damp clothes, but dim enough not to give away the camp's position to watchful eyes. Bedding was whatever could be carried. Warriors laid out cloaks, furs, or straw mats if they'd had time to gather them along the way. Reindeer or sheepskins were prized for their warmth, and those lucky enough to have them often found themselves with company as others edged closer in the night. The ground could be hard and uneven, so some dug shallow pits to rest in, using the earth as a windbreak. In wet conditions, bedding was raised slightly on makeshift platforms of branches to keep it dry. Sleeping arrangements were strategic. Warriors didn't scatter. Beds were made close together in tight clusters, forming a human wall against the night. Shields and weapons were always within reach, propped against logs or laid beside their owners, ready to be grabbed in an instant. Those on the outer edges of the group were usually the ones assigned to the first watch, their rest delayed until their shift ended. Watch rotations were strict. A portion of the party stayed awake at all times, circling the camp or sitting near the fires, scanning the darkness for movement. The sound of quiet conversation or the crackle of a fire served as a reminder to the sleepers that someone was always guarding them. Despite the danger, there was comfort in the closeness. In the dark, under foreign skies, a camp full of breathing, snoring companions was a reassurance that you weren't alone. The smell of smoke, the faint warmth of a shared fire, and the muted glint of a spearhead in the moonlight were all part of the Vikings' nightly ritual on the road. It wasn't the kind of rest that left you refreshed. Muscles still ached, and the mind never quite forgot the nearness of danger. But it was enough to rise at dawn, grip your weapon, and face whatever waited beyond the campfires, whether that was a village ripe for plunder or an enemy force already closing in. In the brutal cold of a Viking winter, sleep was a battle of its own. The longhouses back home offered some shelter, but during travel or when venturing far from settlements, Vikings had to outwit the frost or risk never waking at all. Harsh climates didn't just make sleep uncomfortable, they made it dangerous, and every strategy was born from necessity. One of the oldest tricks was building snow walls. To the untrained eye, lying down next to a pile of snow might seem foolish, but in reality, snow is an excellent insulator. By carving out low walls or half circles around a sleeping area, the Vikings could block biting winds and trap a pocket of slightly warmer air. In deeper drifts, they sometimes dug trenches to sleep in, lining them with branches, furs, or cloaks to keep their bodies off the freezing ground. Layering was another defense. though it wasn't just about piling on clothes. Wool was favoured for its ability to trap heat even when damp, and heavy cloaks made from animal hides, bear, reindeer, or seal added weight and warmth. At night, these layers became a cocoon, often shared between 2 or more people for body heat. Children, or the elderly, would be placed between the strongest members of the group, ensuring the most vulnerable were kept warm through the night. In camps, the fire was the lifeline. It was never allowed to die during winter nights, and someone was always awake to tend it. Vikings would stack stones around the flames to absorb heat, creating makeshift radiators that gave off warmth long after the fire burned low. In harsher winds, fires were dug into pits, with coverings to keep the heat from being stolen by the sky. The smell of smoke would seep into every fur and cloak, a lingering reminder of the fight against the cold. Sometimes, warmth came from more unconventional methods. Vikings might heat stones in the fire and wrap them in cloth to tuck under bedding, creating primitive but effective bed warmers. In emergencies, they even slept close to their animals, sharing heat with livestock that, in such conditions, were just as much companions as they were resources. Winter sleep was rarely deep. The cold had a way of creeping in, waking even the heaviest sleeper to shift closer to the fire or pull a cloak tighter. Frost formed on beards and eyelashes, and the air in a shelter could turn to mist with every breath. Yet, despite the hardships, the Vikings endured, turning the act of surviving a night in freezing darkness into a skill as essential as wielding a sword. By morning, each breath that rose like smoke from their mouths was proof they had won another small victory against the winter. In a Viking longhouse, silence was a luxury no one could afford, and snoring was the enemy of peaceful rest. When entire families, servants, and sometimes livestock slept under the same roof, every sound was magnified. The creak of the wooden walls in the wind, the hiss of the fire, the shuffle of someone turning over, and then there was the thunderous, unrelenting roar of a snorer in full force. With so many people crammed into one space, there was no escaping it. A single loud sleeper could rattle the patience of an entire household. And it wasn't just the occasional rumble some snored like charging bulls, their uneven breaths echoing off the beams above. The closeness made it impossible to ignore. You could roll over, pull a fur over your head, or press your hands to your ears, but sooner or later, the sound would find you. The Vikings didn't have the luxury of moving to a quieter room, so they learned to adapt. Some would deliberately position themselves near the fire or the animals, letting the crackle of flames or the low rustle of livestock mask the noise. Others drank heavily before bed, hoping mead would dull the irritation or help them fall asleep first before the snorer hit their stride. There were more practical solutions too. Heavy bedding, like thick furs and layered cloaks, could be pulled over the head, muffling both the sound and the cold. Those with higher status, who could claim the more desirable sleeping spots, often positioned themselves farther from known snorers, pushing the noisiest sleepers to the far end of the room. And while there's no surviving Viking lore about snoring, it's easy to imagine arguments breaking out over who got stuck next to the loud one. On raids or voyages, the problem was even worse. Packed tightly on a ship or in a small camp, there was no fire to drown out the sound, and no walls to muffle it. A snorer could keep half the crew awake, a cruel irony when rest was essential. Some may have nudged or outright kicked the offender awake, if only for a brief moment of relief before the noise resumed. Snoring wasn't just an annoyance, it could be dangerous. In situations where stealth was vital, a noisy sleeper risked giving away a camp's position. Imagine lying in the dark, listening to distant footsteps in the forest, praying the sound of your companion's nasal roar wouldn't betray you. Still, for all the frustration, the Vikings endured it. They had bigger threats to face than an overworked set of vocal cords. Snoring was just another part of communal life, a nighttime trial to be met with patience, humour, or the occasional sharp elbow. because in a world where warmth and safety came from sleeping close, a little noise was the price of survival. In the Viking world, the sleep of children and infants was a matter of survival. Winters were long and unforgiving, and the smallest members of the household were the most vulnerable to the cold. Every night was a careful balancing act, keeping babies warm, safe, and comforted in homes where privacy didn't exist, and the air could be so cold it stung your lungs. Cradles were common for newborns, often made of wood and built sturdy enough to be passed down through generations. Some were plain, while others were carved with protective symbols meant to ward off illness and evil spirits. These cradles could be gently rocked by hand, though in cramped longhouses they were sometimes tied with rope from the ceiling beams, allowing a mother to sway her child with a simple push while she worked. But more often than not, infants didn't sleep alone. Shared beds were the norm, with babies nestled between their parents or tucked against their mother's side under layers of wool and fur. This closeness kept the child warm and made night feedings easier, especially when bitter winds howled outside and getting out from under the covers meant inviting the cold in. Older siblings sometimes slept beside infants as well, creating a warm cocoon of bodies. Warmth was everything. Reindeer hides, sheepskins, and thick wool blankets were piled high around children, and in the coldest months they were dressed in multiple layers even at night. Small caps covered their heads, and in some households heated stones wrapped in cloth were placed near the bedding to keep frost at bay. The smell of smoke from the central hearth clung to every blanket, a constant reminder of the fire that kept everyone alive. Nighttime in a Viking household wasn't silent, and children grew up accustomed to the noises of communal life. The murmur of adult conversation, the shuffle of animals in the corner, the crackle of the fire, it all became part of their lullaby. Still, parents kept a watchful eye, knowing that sickness, accidents, or the creeping cold could steal a child away without warning. In the depths of winter, when the days were short and the darkness seemed endless, families often slept longer, allowing children more rest and warmth. Yet, the harsh realities of Viking life meant even young ones learned early to adapt to nap when they could, to wake with the household, and to find comfort in the press of family around them. For Viking parents, a sleeping child was more than a peaceful sight. It was proof they had done their job for another day. In a world where the elements were relentless and life was fragile, keeping a baby warm through the night was an act of quiet victory, repeated over and over, winter after winter. For a Viking warrior, sleep was never entirely safe. Even in the comfort of a longhouse, danger could arrive without warning, whether in the form of a rival clan, a thief in the night, or some shadowy figure sent to settle an old feud. On voyages and raids, the risk was even greater. That's why many Vikings went to bed with more than just a blanket for comfort. They slept with weapons close enough to grab before their eyes were fully open. The choice of weapon varied. A wealthy warrior might keep a finely crafted sword at his side, its hilt polished and worn from years of use. Others favoured an axe, smaller than the great two-handed versions used in battle, but perfect for a quick, brutal defence. Spears could be leaned within arm's reach, and even knives were kept under bedding, hidden but ready. For many, the weapon wasn't just protection, it was part of their identity, as essential to them as their cloak or boots. On ships, space was tight, but the rule was the same. Warriors slept on benches or under the open sky, with their shields propped nearby and weapons laid across their chests or tucked along their legs. This way, if an attack came in the night, be it from enemies or the sudden chaos of a boarding, they could spring to their feet without wasting precious seconds searching for their gear. Even at home, the habit persisted. A Viking's reputation was partly built on readiness, and the idea of being caught unarmed was unthinkable. In many households, weapons were kept beside the bed as naturally as a modern person might keep a lamp or water jug. For those living in border regions or unsettled territories, this practice wasn't paranoia, it was common sense. Weapons also served a symbolic purpose. Sleeping with one was a reminder of a warrior's role and responsibilities. It reinforced the idea that vigilance didn't end when the sun went down. Some warriors even believed their weapons carried protective power, warding off both physical and supernatural threats. A sword might be etched with runes, or an axe's head wrapped in charms before it was laid down for the night. Still, there was a certain practicality to the arrangement. In the dark, fumbling for a blade was far easier if it was already in hand's reach. The Vikings understood that survival often came down to moments. How quickly you could react when those moments arrived determined whether you lived to see another dawn. So, when a Viking warrior closed his eyes, he never truly surrendered to sleep. His fingers might be curled loosely around a hilt, his ears tuned to the smallest sound beyond the fire's crackle. In that world, the line between rest and readiness was razor thin, and the steel at his side was as much a part of his night as the dreams in his head. In the Viking world, bedtime wasn't the end of the day's conversation, it was often the best part of it. When the light faded and the day's work was done, the longhouse transformed into something more than just a shelter. The glow of the central hearth softened the shadows, the smell of wood smoke hung heavy in the air, and people gathered on their bedding not just to rest, but to talk. Sleep was communal, and so was everything that happened before it. This was when stories came alive. Elders recounted sagas of gods and heroes, their voices weaving through the room as the flicker of firelight danced across faces. Children listened wide-eyed, hearing of Thor's battles, Odin's wisdom, and voyages to lands they could barely imagine. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were lessons in courage, loyalty, and cunning, passed down in the warm stillness of the night. There was gossip, too plenty of it, news from neighbouring settlements, whispered scandals, and the endless speculations about who would marry whom or which trader was cheating the scales. In a society where news travelled slowly, the longhouse at night was a hub of information, where facts and rumours blurred together in the telling. And then there were the smaller, more intimate conversations. Friends lying side by side might share private thoughts, plans for the next day, or quiet confessions only meant for one another. Couples might murmur to each other beneath the firs, while a child might fall asleep to the sound of a parent's voice humming a soft tune. These nightly gatherings forged bonds as much as they passed the time. Sharing a sleep space meant knowing the rhythms of each other's breathing, the sound of a laugh in the dark, the comfort of a familiar presence nearby. In a world that could be harsh and violent, there was a rare kind of safety in that closeness. It wasn't always serene, of course. Arguments could break out over snoring, stolen blankets, or a poorly timed joke. But even disagreements became part of the social fabric, resolved in the glow of the fire before everyone finally settled down. The night in a Viking longhouse wasn't just about shutting out the cold, it was about drawing in the warmth of human connection. Long after the sagas were told, and the gossip faded into murmurs, the room would fall into the steady rhythm of sleep, a dozen heartbeats beating in the same space. For the Vikings, sleep wasn't an isolated, private act. It was woven into the community, a shared experience where bonds were strengthened, stories preserved, and the ties that held the household together were renewed night after night until the morning came. For the Vikings, rest wasn't confined to the long, firelit hours of night. In a world driven by the demands of farming, trading, and seafaring, they understood the value of a well-timed pause in the middle of the day. The Viking nap wasn't laziness, it was strategy, a way to recharge so the body could keep up with the grueling pace of their lives. On the farm, the work began with the first light. Fields needed ploughing, animals needed tending, and repairs to tools and structures were never-ending. By midday, the sun, when it chose to appear, was high, and the body was tired from hours of labour. This was when many Vikings would stop for a short rest. They might stretch out on a bench inside the longhouse, lay back in the grass if the weather allowed, or even doze in the shade of a barn. It wasn't unusual for these naps to happen in full view of others. Privacy wasn't a Viking luxury, and no one thought twice about a neighbour snatching a few minutes of shut-eye. At sea, naps became even more important. Voyages could last for weeks, and the rhythm of rowing, steering, and keeping watch was exhausting. Sleep on a ship was often taken in shifts, but during calm stretches of sailing, especially if the wind was doing the work, crew members might grab a quick nap on the deck. Wrapped in cloaks, and using a coiled rope or bundled sail for a pillow, they would rest with one ear open, ready to rouse if the weather changed or danger approached. These short sleeps weren't deep or luxurious, but they were enough to keep minds sharp and bodies strong. A Viking nap was rarely about sinking into dreams. It was about resting just long enough to shake off fatigue before getting back to work. In the fields, a farmer might wait to the sound of a cow lowing. At sea, a sailor's nap might end with a crewmate's nudge and a warning of dark clouds on the horizon. Naps also played into the seasonal rhythm of Viking life. In the long days of summer, when the sun barely dipped below the horizon, many people split their rest into several shorter periods rather than one long night of sleep. In the short, dark days of winter, naps were a way to stay warm and conserve energy, with families gathering near the fire for a midday doze as the wind rattled the longhouse walls. To the Vikings, sleep was a tool, not an indulgence. Whether it came in the form of a deep night's rest or a stolen half-hour in the middle of the day, it kept them ready to work, ready to fight, ready to weather whatever the north threw at them. A nap wasn't weakness. It was part of the rhythm that kept the Viking world turning. When we look back at the way Vikings slept, it's tempting to see it as primitive communal rooms, straw bedding, furs piled high, and the occasional sheep bleating in the corner. But the more you peel back the layers, the more it becomes clear that their approach to rest was deeply practical, even surprisingly advanced in its own way. Viking sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about survival, community, and making the most of the resources at hand. They understood warmth better than we give them credit for layering furs, using body heat, and building homes that trapped warmth where it was most needed. They adapted their sleep to the seasons, letting the sun and darkness dictate their rhythms instead of fighting against them. And their segmented sleep patterns, with breaks in the night for conversation, chores, or quiet reflection, feel oddly similar to what sleep researchers now say was once common for humans everywhere. The communal nature of their rest is perhaps the biggest difference from today. We live in a world where sleep is often private and silent, but for Vikings, it was a shared experience. Families, servants, and even animals slept side by side, wrapped in the same heat, hearing the same stories before drifting off. That closeness created bonds, an unspoken reassurance that no one faced the night alone. Their superstitions and rituals around dreams and protection also tell us something important. They didn't see sleep as idle time. It was a state where the mind could receive messages, where spirits could visit, and where the boundaries between the seen and unseen blurred. Whether it was charms under pillows or interpreting omens before battle, they treated rest as a time of meaning, not just recovery. And perhaps most fascinating of all, Vikings knew how to make rest flexible. On land or sea, they napped when they could, adapted their schedules to the work and weather, and didn't cling to a single right way to sleep. That kind of adaptability is something our rigid, clock-bound world could learn from. Modern life has given us comfortable mattresses, climate control, and blackout curtains, yet we still struggle with sleep. The Vikings, with none of those luxuries, managed to rest well enough to farm harsh lands, sail dangerous seas, and wage battles that have echoed through history. Maybe the lesson isn't that we should all start sleeping in longhouses with goats at our feet, but that we should remember what they understood, that sleep is about more than comfort. It's about connection, resilience, and working with the world around you, not against it. In their furs and firelit halls, the Vikings mastered the art of sleeping on their own terms, and in a way, that might be the most modern thing about them.